Okay, let's start looking at some Chapter 14 related questions. We'll get a refresher here in number 1 by looking at filing status. In it, we want to determine Mr. Smith's 2021 filing status in each of the following independent cases. So the first one we have here, Mr. Smith and Mrs. Smith were legally divorced on December 1st. Mr. Smith has not remarried and has no dependent children. Right, so we have two kind of scenarios we're going to be looking at, and we need to look at December 31st. So on December 31st, if they're married, then your options would be either married filing jointly or married filing separately. If on December 31st they were not married, your options would be head of household or single. Okay, so in A here, they were divorced on December 1st. So on December 31st, Mr. Smith was not married again. So that means his options would be either head of household or single. And what we need to look at here is, are there any dependents? Well, it says here, no dependent children. So for Mr. Smith, if he had dependent children, would have been a head of household. But since there are no dependent children, he is going to be considered single for 2021. In B, it says Mr. Smith and the first Mrs. Smith were legally divorced on February the 10th. Mr. Smith remarried the second Mrs. Smith on December the 5th. He has no dependent children. Right, so again, we're looking at December 31st, and we're focusing on Mr. Smith. So right, on December 31st, he is married. He's technically married to the second Mrs. Smith, but still married. So options would be either married filing jointly or married filing separately. Right, so I guess he could make a decision either way. So he'd either be married filing jointly or married filing separately. In C, it says Mrs. Smith dies on June 22nd. Mr. Smith is not remarried and has no dependent children. In this case, Mrs. Smith has passed away in the current year. So for the current year, you can still file married filing jointly if you so desire. In D, it says Mrs. Smith died on November 1st, 2019. Mr. Smith has not remarried and maintains a home for one dependent child. So in this case, it's not the current year, but you go out 2 years from the end of that. So for the 2019 year, Mr. Smith would have been married filing jointly because that's the same year. And then if there is a dependent, which there is one dependent, for the next 2 tax years, which would be 2020 and 21, then he could continue to file married filing jointly. And that's because he's considered a surviving spouse. In E, it says Mrs. Smith died on April 3rd, 2020. Mr. Smith has not remarried and has no dependent children. So that no dependent children is going to be important because it's not the current year. So, but for 2020, if that was the year we were looking at, Mr. Smith would be able to be married filing jointly because it's the current year. Well, you look out 2 years only if there's a dependent from that point. So since there's no dependent, Mr. Smith goes back to being single because he has not remarried. And there's no dependent children. And then in F, it says Mr. and Mrs. Smith were legally divorced on September 10th, 2018. Mr. Smith has not remarried and maintains a home for his 2 dependent children. Right, so in this case, not married, so the options would be head of household or single. Are there dependents? Yeah, there are 2 dependents. So he would be considered a head of household. Okay, so let's look at number 2 here. It says Leon died on August 23rd, 2018, and his wife Mary has not remarried. Since her husband's death, Mary has maintained a home for her 2 dependent children who were ages 7 and 4 when their father died. Which of the following describes Mary's filing status for 2019, 2020, and 2021? So one, I forgot to update our choices here. So we'll just move these up. Let me go in and move these up and I'll be right back. We're looking at really how the options would be presented to you. I didn't want to mention it, but I technically updated the correct answer, but I didn't update the other answers. Okay, so one key is passed away in 2018. Right, so for 2018, they would be married filing jointly because that's the year in which the one spouse passed away. So then after that, for the next 2 years, right, 2 years after, which would be 2019 and 2020, what you want to look for is there a dependent child? Yes, and they put here the ages, just in case you're wondering why the ages are there, so you'll know that it's going to be many years before they reach 18. Right? So they're going to be dependents for several years after 2018. That's why they put that there for you to review. Because you will have some situations where they age out sometime in between. So in this case, since there is or are dependents, for 2019 and 2020, that's the 2 years you can be married filing jointly and technically, by being a surviving spouse. But then after those 2 years, you'll be going back to your unmarried situations, right? So you'll be considered unmarried for 2021. And what you want to look for is, are you going to be head of household or single? In this case, there is a dependent and will be a dependent still in 2021. So you're going to be a head of household in 2021. Hopefully in practice you don't get hit with all of this at one time, but maybe you are catching somebody up on old returns, and that would be the case here. So you'd be 2019, 20, and 21 is what it's asking us about. In 2019 and 20, you're going to be married filing jointly. In 2021, you're going to be a head of household, right? And that's going to be choice B.